Good morning, passengers. Welcome to Martel Air. My name's Amanda, and I'll be your pilot for today. We're just beginning boarding for flight number 7 from Mount Beauty to Sale, so grab your seats while I finish up the last steps of the pre-flight inspections of this Cessna Grand Caravan, the pride of the Martel Air fleet. And you may notice that I have been working on the paint job for the plane, just small upgrades including working out how to put some tail art on. I am rather pleased with how that's gone. Before engine start checklist. Pre-flight inspection complete. Parking brake handle set. Switches off. Ignition switch normal. Fuel tank selectors both on. Bleed air heat switch off. Power lever idle. Prop RPM max, fuel condition cut off, fuel shut off knob on, battery switch on, cabin lights on, cockpit lighting, set, wing flaps up, no smoking light on. Before engine start checklist complete. The weather today is clear and sunny, and we'll be cruising at an altitude of about 9,000 feet, flying over a lot of very hilly forest on the way. Your cabin crew today is me, and your emergency exits are located to the back of the cabin where you entered the plane. I also have a door up here by me, and if you see me leave, please follow me quickly. Our in-flight catering services are provided by our wonderful passengers, so I hope you pack something interesting. Engine start checklist. Battery switch on. Beacon light on. Avionics 1 on. Bus volts check. Emergency power lever normal. Inertial separator handle bypass. EIS readings check. Propeller area clear. Fuel boost switch on. Fuel boost on check. Fuel pressure low not shown check. Fuel flow 0 check. Starter switch start. Ignition on check. Oil PSI check. NG climbing. NG stable. Fuel condition lever low idle. Fuel flow check. NG climbing. NG stable. Starter switch off. EIS readings check. Generator load check. Battery amps check. Fuel boost normal. Avionics 2 on. Nav lights on. And you may notice that I've also adjusted the view so that you can see the map when I'm looking at the instruments. We're now ready for departure, so please fasten your seatbelts and turn off your devices, apart from those used to watch this stream. Thank you for flying Martel Air. We hope you don't die. Before taxi checklist. Taxi lights on. Seatbelt light on. Taxi clearance. Mount Beauty traffic, Martel 07 is taxiing to runway 32 for takeoff. Prop RPM minimum, fuel condition low idle, inertial separator to bypass, parking brake off. Now, it's going to be a rather interesting takeoff today because as I was getting set up for the flight, a couple of young men in can't-see-me suits paid me a visit and said that there was some classified cargo to be taken to sale as part of our flight today. I don't know what the cargo is. All I know is we're making one stop in East Sale before we make a delivery, before we make our landing in West Sale. And I will in fact be rambling about why Sale, a relatively small town, has two airports at it, or an airport and a RAAF base. But here we are on the runway. So, the plane is today loaded to its maximum takeoff weight. I in fact had to check the amount of fuel required for this flight because the cargo pod underneath the plane is loaded exactly to capacity. And that puts us pretty well on our maximum takeoff weight. I've been having some fun looking up what the load is. It's not in any of the manuals I could find because it turns out it's written on the inside of the hatch covers that let you put things into the cargo pod. So when you open it up, you see how much it can take. It's about 500 kilos of cargo between the four sections under there, which is fairly impressive. So we will be doing a short field takeoff procedure, which is going to be interesting. Okay, before takeoff checklist. Parking brake handle set. Altimeter QNH set. Standby flight instruments check. Fuel boost switch normal. Fuel tank selectors both on. Fuel quantity check. Fuel shutoff knob on. Standby alt power on. Anti-ice system, it's 25 degrees, we do not require an anti-ice system. Inertial separator handle normal, we need all the power we can get for this takeoff. Autopilot, heading mode, bank mode, flight level change mode, altitude set to 9,000 feet. Check. Flight level change speed set to VX. Heading mode set to runway heading. Bank mode, heading mode, flight level change mode. Yacht button. Autopilot set, transponder on alt. Flaps takeoff. Takeoff clearance. Mount Beauty traffic, Martel 07 is taking off runway 32 south departure. Takeoff clearance check. Strobe lights on. Landing lights on. Seatbelt light on. Parking brake release. Fuel condition high idle. Prop RPM to max. Before takeoff checklist complete. Okay. Short field takeoff procedures. Brakes on. Flaps to takeoff position. Advance the power. Let the engine stabilize at power. Release the brakes. Into the air, clearing the fence. I have previously tested this flight without using the short takeoff procedure. Flaps up. And while we managed to clear the fence at the end of the runway, it was closer than I'd like. But that short takeoff procedure got us into the air with probably 100 meters to spare, which is delightful. And making sure not to cook the engine as we climb out of here. And as you can see, I'm also taking quite a bit longer to climb out from this airport before doing the turn onto our nav path, and that is quite simply because of this valley that we're in. There was a nice pathway down into the runway on our way in, and on our way out it is the only way we can climb before we get to these hills. The hills which are in fact still above us as we approach 3,000 feet, and I will now switch us to VY climb instead of VX. And it looks like we've got 3 passengers currently awake back there, which is nice. Hello, especially if you are feeling like saying anything to me in the chat. And just checking the instruments, making sure we're doing a nice climb out. It really is quite pretty countryside, just we need to not fly into it. And we also need to not cook the engine while not flying into it. And as with last time, we are joined by Wing Commander Lamington, my co-pilot. He is clearly doing a good job of monitoring the instruments there. It's always good to have somebody to back you up with this sort of thing. We are still below the mountaintops. And we're climbing through 3,600, 3,700. Melbourne Centre, Martel 07 is type Cessna Caravan, 6 miles northwest of Yankee Mike Bravo Tango, 4,200 feet. Request flight following. Or 1217 Martel 07. Roger, Martel 07. And it looks like we are finally clear of these mountains, which is lovely to see. Gonna give us a little bit more altitude before we try and fly over them, of course. But it looks like we've got a bit more clear way that way than to that side. But unfortunately, we need to go that way. Heading around. Let's actually do the loop this way. we will essentially be overflying the airport on our way back. So yes, as I was saying, I've been doing some looking into the weights and balance stats for this plane, which can get rather interesting. And also I spent some time researching what the default assumed passenger weight is for commercial planes in Australia. In the US and thus in Microsoft Flight Simulator, the assumed default passenger weight is 170 pounds or 77 kilos. And in Australia, it turns out to be 86 kilos or about 190 pounds, which is interesting. So, where this plane has previously just leapt into the sky because I've just had default assumed weights for the pilot and co-pilot, I've now set it up with my weight approximately. I was a little generous to myself in the pilot's seat, Lamington's weight in the co-pilot seat, and all 8 passenger seats with the assumed 86 kilos. And you'll be happy to know that that 86 kilos also comes with another 7 kilos of assumed carry-on luggage. So in the cargo pod, or the cargo area at the back of the cabin, which you can see just back there past your invisible selves, you each have 7 kilos of carry-on luggage weighing down the plane. And then, as I was mentioning, there is another set of weights in the cargo pod underneath. So let me just do some quick maths here. That is 470 kilos of weight in the cargo pod underneath, which for something that is essentially a fiberglass construction bolted onto the bottom of an otherwise complete plane, it's actually a fairly impressive amount of stuff. And also updates from last stream, I'm hoping that the audio quality is going to be a little bit better. I've spent a few hours experimenting with getting the exact right settings in OBS because I've actually got a better mic than last week's audio quality might tell you. And we are just coming up on nearly 8,000 feet. So making sure we are intercepting. Hate when you use the mouse wheel and it turns out to also be the zoom. Intercepting the actual nav path. So yes, the runway that we just took off from is 1,500 meters long, which is fairly short as far as getting something this big fully loaded into the air goes. And it's 10 meters wide, which is fairly small as far as airports go. And I've been looking into Mount Beauty, and the Mount Beauty airport website, I'm still going to call it an aerodrome because it's not big enough to be called an airport really, but the Mount Beauty Airport Company aerodrome website doesn't actually have the usual weather information like you'd get over the radio as a pilot. What they have instead is a single page on the website with the current weather as automatically generated, and charmingly they also have a webcam pointed at the windsock. So if you need to know what the windsock's doing when you're going to be flying in there, instead of asking somebody what the weather is, you get on your phone, you look up the website, and you find the webcam pointed at the windsock. It's delightful. I love these small airports and aerodromes for their it's charming the way they do things that is just all automated, and I was not expecting windsock emojis, but here we go. I'm now curious if there's an actual windsock. There's enough other weird random things. Windsocks are actually a fascinating piece of technology, despite the fact that they look like a tube hung up in the breeze. So as well as telling you which direction the wind is pointing, the design and weight of them is actually calibrated so that depending on how many sections of it are standing straight out, you can actually tell approximately what the wind speed is. It's a wonderful bit of design. I don't really know how to read them that well because it's all the modern technology and just letting things come from the computer. Looks like we've got about half an hour on this first leg of the flight. But yes, as a way to visually check the wind, because wind is notably invisible, it's a rather clever way to do it. And then having the modern adaptation being a webcam pointed at it, that is just delightful to me. I'm still not calling them an airport, but I love it. So we are flying down into the town of Sale today, which is one where I actually used to live, which is part of why I picked it. And there are actually two airfields at Sale. There is the West Sale Airport and the RAAF Base East Sale. They actually used to both be both be military airfields in World War II. They were basically the entire Sale region was one of the homes of pilot training and other training work for the RAAF, which, for those of you unfamiliar with Australian stuff, RAAF is the Royal Australian Airport. And to the question in the chat, why do you not call tiny airfields airports? To me, an airport implies a certain level of facilities and structure. A single runway with grass parking next to it, and the terminal facilities are listed as public toilets and tea and coffee facilities for pilots. I don't think that actually captures the level of development that an airport implies. So the general term used in aviation is aerodrome, and that covers everything in the airport airfield category. I think it actually covers certain lakes as well, those that are set up with seaplane docking facilities, which is delightful. There are aerodromes which are in fact just a dock on a lake. But yeah, to me, airport implies something with a terminal building, maybe some taxiways, some parking that's paved, that sort of thing. It's probably just me being picky and possibly somewhat unfair, you never know. But it's a distinction that I have decided to make in my head. I might be being completely arbitrary, you never know. Okay, cruise checklist. Seatbelt lights remaining on with this level of turbulence. Anti-ice system off. Inertial separator normal. Prop RPM. I see. Landing lights off. Prop RPM set. Power lever set. Fuel balance check. ITT check. And yes, having things to be arbitrary about is indeed one of the joys of living. I find so many of them. So, I was rambling about Sale having two airfields. Or two aerodromes. So there used to be RAAF Base East Sale and RAAF Base West Sale, which is why the only commercial airport in Sale is called West Sale and the RAAF Base is called East Sale. It is home to the RAAF roulettes, which are... East Sale is home to the RAAF roulettes, which are the aerobatic display team, similar to the British Red Arrows or the US Blue Angels. They don't fly quite such ridiculous jets as, especially the Blue Angels. But the thing about living in the town with their home base is that you get to see them quite a lot because they have to practice. So, living there, rather got used to seeing the roulettes, practicing, doing this year's routine. Practicing. There's something lovely about going to the pool, floating on your back, and watching the aerobatics team practice. It was one of the few things I liked about Sale. In general, Sale is a lovely town to visit. Don't live there. I actually lived on RAAF East Sale for a while there because of reasons. And one of my favourite things about living on base was the fact that I had a pass to get past base security at the front gate to get home, and anybody following me home from school didn't. It was glorious. And yeah, we are having quite some weather, as we often do over these mountains. So 18 knot crosswind with slightly gusty headwinds as well. So we're currently turned about 5 degrees off the direction we're actually going, which I find utterly hilarious. This is one of the things with flying, is that the direction you're going over the ground only matters for navigation. For actually flying, it's the direction you're going relative to the air, which is more complicated, especially when you're trying to land. You'll sometimes see planes coming in pointing the wrong way compared to the runway, because up until the moment they touch the runway, what they care about is the direction that the air's going. This is why crosswind landings are hard. Back to the ramble about Sale. So, the reason that they still have two is that when one of the two was closed down, it was decided that, you know what, this is still a useful airfield. We'll just convert West Sale into the commercial one. And Sale is one of the bigger towns in Gippsland, which is the entire southeast region of Victoria. It's kind of unofficial capital is the perception I got when I was there. I don't know how much of that is biased from living there. But it was decided that it would be useful to keep the second one open when post-World War II closing down all of the old military bases was kind of the tradition. Because you don't need as many when it's not World War II. Okay, just checking that we're flying properly and not about to crash. Lovely. Because the thing about once I start rambling, I need to remember to also fly. One of the first lessons in aviation is a saying called Aviate, Navigate, Communicate. And this one was actually drilled into me from a very young age, because my dad is former actual pilot. So, you know, when I was learning to drive, Aviate, Navigate, Communicate. Just the priority list. And even before then, just drilled into you. So, aviate. Make sure that you're still in the sky, not crashing into something, not falling out of the sky. Navigate. Make sure you're in the right bit of the sky, going to the place you're actually meant to be going. Communicate. Tell other people what you're doing. In a flying context, that's being on the radios. In a driving context, that's things like using your blinkers. And this is a priority list. If you have to concentrate on only one thing, don't crash. If you have enough time to concentrate on two things, don't crash and go in the right bit of the sky. If you've got spare capacity, don't crash, go the place you're meaning to go, and talk to people so that they know what you're doing. It doesn't matter if you know knowing which mountain you flew into is less important than not flying into the mountain. Dun, dun, dun. 24 minutes to go. Given we are nice and stable and cruising, I think it's about time for the in-flight entertainment section, where I do a bit more Australian poetry. We are still on the Banjo Paterson selection for now, and getting back to another one of my childhood bedtime stories, to be quite honest. I had that sort of childhood. I'm sure several people here know what that's like. So, this one will be a poem called A Bush Christening. It is one of the aren't things a bit silly and disconnected out in the rural areas. And it is about a christening in the bush, thus a bush christening. And this one's from 1893, so again, reasonably old. This is, like, Banjo Paterson is one of the ones that is considered one of the foundational poets for Australian culture. You get those, especially with a young country. Like, England gets to pick, like, Shakespeare and Chaucer and apply their stuff to the entire language. We just get the guy who was writing stuff when the country was working out its identity. Just double checking instruments, because reading poetry is definitely filed under communicate. Engine's good, speed's good, altitude's good, lovely. And I just set a nice view out the side. Okay. So, poetry. On the outer Baku, where the churches are few, and men of religion are scanty, on a road never crossed, except by folk that are lost, one Michael McGee had a shanty. Now this Mike was the dad of a 10-year-old lad, plump, healthy, and stoutly conditioned. He was strong as the best, but poor Mike had no rest, for the youngster had never been christened. And his wife used to cry, if the darlin' should die, St. Peter would not recognise him. But by luck he survived till a preacher arrived, who agreed straight away to baptise him. Now the artful young rogue, while they held their collogue, with his ear to the keyhole was listening. And he muttered in fright, while his features turned white, what the devil and all is this christening? He was none of your dolts. He had seen them brand colts, and it seemed to his small understanding, if the man in the frock made him one of the flock, it must mean something very like branding. So away with a rush he set off for the bush, while the tears in his eyelids they glistened. "It's outrageous," said he, "to brand youngsters like me. I'll be dashed if I'll stop to be christened." Like a young native dog, he ran into a log, and his father, with language uncivil, never heeding the priest, cried aloud in his haste, "Come out and be christened, you devil!" But he lay there as snug as a bug in a rug, and his parents in vain might reprove him, till his reverence spoke. He was fond of a joke. "I've a notion," says he, "that'll move him. Poke a stick up the log, give the spalpeen a prod. Poke him easy, don't hurt him or maim him. 'Tis not long that he'll stand, I've the water at hand. As he rushes out this end, I'll name him. Here he comes, and for shame you've forgotten the name. Is it Patsy or Michael or Dinnis?" Here the youngster ran out, and the priest gave a shout, "Take your chance anyhow with McGuinness." As the howling young cub ran away to the scrub, where he knew that pursuit would be risky, the priest, as he fled, flung a flask at his head that was labelled McGuinness's whiskey. And McGuinness McGee has been made a JP, and the one thing he hates more than sin is to be asked by the folk who have heard of the joke how he came to be christened McGuinness. So there we go. Lovely little bit of people are ridiculous and do silly things. And yes, JP in that last verse is Justice of the Peace, which is a reasonably, a quite respectable officer of the courts, the law, that sort of thing. These days they do a lot of witnessing documents and that sort of thing. But yeah, so hearing that poem as one of my bedtime stories was formative. Now, one thing you get in Banjo Paterson stuff, and yes, not having the Hands of the Emperor emojis is always weird for anything with emojis. I don't know if I can add custom ones. It would confuse people greatly if I just added a whole set of iguana emojis to a YouTube thing. It would be funny, but it would confuse people. As the creator of the iguana emojis, I in fact have all of the files to do that. I just need to work out if that's a thing YouTube lets me do. Probably isn't. And I am definitely enjoying having the low latency instead of normal latency on the chat. It means I can actually respond to things instead of waiting. It's like a 5 to 10 second delay instead of about 30. That was weird last week. Look, a little light baffling is something that I've rather made my entire style around. And we've still got about 17 minutes left before we get down towards sail. Now, one of the things I was talking about last week is size comparisons of this plane compared to other things that it looks like, because it's just a Cessna high-wing single-engine plane. It must be about the same size as all the others, surely? Turns out that when it's got seating for 10 people total plus cargo, it's actually not that small, despite being a standard Cessna design language single-engine high-wing plane. And I've actually found the comparison picture I put together for this. It took me a while just because remembering what you name things in a huge document drive. So let's see if this works. Ah, that's how. Haha. So here we have a comparison size of 3 different things. The one on top is the Cessna Grand Caravan EX, which is what we are currently flying. The plane just below it, to the same scale, is the Cessna 172, basically the most common plane in existence. That is what most people think of when they picture your standard small light aviation plane, or light general aviation. And the car pictured there is what I drive, so that is a 2004 Hyundai Santa Fe, which these days would be classified in the medium SUV bracket. But it really puts into perspective the scale of this plane, in that this really is a small to medium commuter bus, not a light aircraft. I mean, the fact that we've slung half a ton of weight into the bottom cargo space there, which is most of the weight of a small hatchback, like about half of the small hatchback, really gives some perspective to this and why it was so heavy lifting off. So yes, there we go. That is... Putting that diagram together was definitely a moment of realization for me, just in... Oh, this plane, now I've actually got a sense of scale for it. Because, you know, if we look back here, you can see that those aren't cramped seats. In fact, Lamington, you have the controls for a bit. Like you can see, it's actually reasonably roomy back here. And then, as mentioned, little cargo area down the back. So there's the entrance you will have come in by. It's even got its own attached stairs. There's the cargo door. And look, you even got ventilation and speakers. Now we'll sidle our way back up to the cockpit. Thanks, buddy. Now, it's still not a high ceiling. It's still like you're climbing into a van or similar, but it's definitely roomier than you might think. Lamington's full name: Wing Commander Lamington Pavlova Vegemite Skymaster Martel. I'm in fact working on a mod to try and make a collar to go onto him. See if I can make that work so that he'll have his first officer stripes on the collar, which I think will be adorable. How's the navigation going? Now we are just coming in towards the area where we'll need to start getting clearances to land. East Sale Tower, Martel 07 is 26 miles north, 9,000 feet, with information Mike requests permission to approach for landing, with permission as filed, Flight Commander 453 Squadron East Sale. Fly left base, runway 22, Martel 07. The joys of flying into military airports is that they require permissions. And unfortunately, seatbelt modelling is a whole extra level of complexity that I don't think anybody's really worked out. Okay. Of having to program this bit on the fly while flying. Because I set the flight plan for the second airport, which might have been a mistake, but there we go. Visual runway 22. Straight in path for it. And activate that. The joys of flying visual approaches and patterns. Not to be down at more like, let's call it 4,000 feet. Seatbelts are entirely a thing that's necessary in this sort of plane. They are not included on the modelling for this one, but whoop, that is the wrong button. The actual plane does in fact have a full set of seatbelts. In fact, pilots have more seatbelt than passengers do. So you have the lap belt that goes across. I'm assuming that the seatbelts are just like tucked in beside the seats to make it look neat. That's my excuse. So passengers get that lap belt that holds you into the chair if something interesting and dramatic happens. Whereas the pilots will have one of those, and they will also have the shoulder harness, which is pretty much exactly as it sounds. It's the two extra straps that come across over the shoulders and clip into the same buckle in the center front. And that is so not only are they not falling out of the seat when something dramatic happens, but they also remain controlled. So shoulders stay back against the controls so they can still operate the plane. The reason that you get told to keep your seatbelt on for turbulence is if something really dramatic happens and the plane drops, you might get thrown against the ceiling and injured. It has happened. So, you know, when they say leave your seatbelt on at least loosely for the entire flight, which is actually what you're meant to do, not they say they turn the light off and you just take it off immediately. If you hit sudden turbulence, I'd rather have the seatbelt mostly holding me onto the chair instead of going from +1 G as normal to -2 for about a quarter second. It's the sort of thing that can just happen unexpectedly. And they like to set up systems such that by default, if that happens, nothing goes wrong. Attention passengers, we're now approaching RAAF Base East Sale, and I've kept the seatbelt lights on, which means you should still have your seatbelts fastened. Enjoy this riddle and more as we come in towards our first landing, although you are not allowed off the plane at this landing. And thank you for flying Martel Air. We hope you don't die. So yes, if you're flying somewhere and you could just leave the seatbelt on, maybe loosened a little just so it's slightly more comfortable, probably a good idea to do that. 99 times out of 100, possibly 999 times out of 1,000, it won't matter in the least, but the one time it does matter, I'd rather have the seatbelt on. So during cruise, the pilots will go from full harness just down to the lap belt, which is why they've got the fancy buckle that has multiple connections into it, so they can just have the lap harness on, or they can have the full shoulder harnesses as well. It's rather a useful thing to be able to do, because having the full shoulder harnesses on, which is required for takeoff and landing and that sort of thing, essentially when they turn the seatbelt lights on for you, they put the shoulder harnesses on for them. But yeah, it means that they've got shoulders against the seat, they are in exactly the right position for flying, and even if the plane goes upside down, they're going to stay exactly where they're meant to. Now, we are out of the mountains and definitely into Gippsland. You can see there is rather a lot of that lighter green that is farmland. Gippsland is dairy country. The entire countryside around here is coos as far as the eye can see and the nose can smell. Some of the best cheeses and yogurts and such in Australia come from this sort of region. Not Sale itself. Sale is kind of your commercial hub in between all of the places doing useful things. Let's see if we can actually see it. It can be difficult to spot, of course. And there we've got the Gippsland Lakes and out into the ocean, which I believe here we've switched from the Pacific into the Bass Strait. Yeah, so Sale is that sort of direction. You can just kind of see smudges and things. Okay, start working on the approach now. Approach checklist, seatbelt lights on, fuel tank selectors both on, fuel condition high idle, prop RPM to max, flaps into approach position, landing lights on. Inertial separator to bypass, and brakes off. Okay. So this is the first of the flights where we'll actually be doing 2 total flights, just because with the switch to making the delivery into East Sale and then doing the flight over to park and land in West Sale. And essentially I'm doing that because I wanted to show off, look, this town has 2 airports, isn't that weird? And there we can see RAAF East Sale, and then just west of East Sale is Sale. Shocking, I know. Let's get down a little more. Set up for the approach stuff. Lovely. cleared to land runway 22, Martel 07. Now, of course, in real life, I doubt that a random civilian plane like this would get tasked to carry some cargo from Mount Beauty to Sale, but it gave me a good excuse for why we're flying there. In general, this plane would not be permitted to land in a military base like that. That would just be silly. But we are... I looked up the proper phrasing for how to say what permission I got to approach, you know, which RAAF squadron and which officer I need to get the permission from. Because who you need to ask is publicly available information. It's just that you're generally going to get told no. Okay, final approach checklist. Seatbelt lights on, flaps to land, airspeed calming back. Ooh, we've got a 10 to 15 knot headwind, which is a little spicy, but nothing too much on the crosswind, which is useful at least. And I mentioned the crosswind and it was listening. One of the things about these big, wide open plains with nothing on it but cows is that there's nothing to stop the wind. So when you get a wind whipping across these plains, it just keeps going. Autopilot off. Bit long, but a lovely smooth landing. Okay, flaps up. Contacting ground on 127.25, Martel 07. East Sale ground, Martel 07, request taxi to parking for delivery. Taxiing to general aviation parking via taxiway Bravo Charlie Alpha, Martel 07. Okay. After landing, wing flaps up, standby alt power off, strobe off, landing lights off, taxi lights on. What taxi checklists? Taxi lights on, seatbelt lights on, taxi clearance check, neutral separated bypass, prop RPM to minimum, fuel condition low idle, parking brake off. Okay. And clearing that message. And of course, just because we're coming in towards a parking is not actually the end of the stream, because as mentioned, we have one more flight to do. It's just a short one across to the other side of town, but to the place where we're actually allowed to drop off passengers. I'm sure that in a real situation, if we for some reason did have to do this delivery and we're also carrying civilian passengers who are not coming here, there would be all sorts of muscular young people in can't-see-me suits surrounding the plane, making sure that nobody misbehaves. But luckily we've got Wing Commander Lamington here, who is clearly also the military liaison in this situation, since Wing Commander is a RAAF, or Royal Australian Air Force rank. For American comparison, it is the Air Force equivalent of Lieutenant Colonel. Because, as mentioned last week when I was introducing Wing Commander Lamington, the British Air Force and all of its descendants went with Navy instead of Army ranks. Exactly why, I couldn't say, but given that they're both the vehicle-focused services, I think it makes sense. And honestly, watching American media, it's always a little bit odd when they've got unmodified Army ranks for the Air Force. I'm so used to the rank telling you the service as well. Of course, that would imply that Space Force would have things like, I don't know, Rocket Commander? And instead of airman or aircraft man/aircraft woman, it would be Rocket Man. And here is a marshal telling us where to park. Nicely marked delivery box. Okay, and now for safety, we cut the engine. Parking brake set, prop feather, power to idle. But we are not doing a full shutdown. We come in here, and we tell Flight Sim that the cargo is being unloaded. Yeah. When I set you to 0, you could stay at 0? There we go. So that is 500 kilos off what we're carrying. This is not the sort of display that I usually have set. I usually hide those sorts of things off on my other screen that's also holding OBS. And yes, the existence of the Space Force is odd. Stargate taught us that space belongs to the Air Force, didn't it? Which is, by the way, my main exposure to US Air Force ranks and things. Okay. Now then, setting up the navigation for the next leg of the flight. It still has West Sail. Okay, let's set up for an approach. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Yeah, the way that it's dashing young people in dark rooms looking at fancy computer screens. That's the way you get eye strain. Like, I love a good darkened room, but you need to balance the room light and the screen light, otherwise you're going to get eye strain. So all that's telling me is that the American Space Force is trying to ruin the eyesight of its staff, which is not a good sign. Okay. And I'm going to declare that unloading of the plane is done at this point. And we'll just have another little look at the new livery while we're parked. It's pretty much like the old one, but I've worked out some... I make it so you can see the tail. I have worked out how to put a nice version of the badge onto the tail there. And I've also cleaned up the anti-ice strips along the front of everything, so they are now shining in their proper silver. And then you can see the taxi lights, which are nice and bright. Yes, oh yes, also put the badge on the wings. And there's one on the bottom of the cargo pod, but you can't see that. That's to advertise to people we're flying over. And back into the plane after a quick check that all of those hatches are secure. And most things are still set up. Pre-flight check, parking brake set. Let's go into the engine start checklist. Yes, very shiny is indeed how I would sum up, but thank you for the compliment to the paint job. I've been having some fun working on the modelling side for flight sim, such as working on... Now, how do I load in a new co-pilot mesh? Because I've taken the basic mesh provided by the Got Friends Man's Best Friend mod, which is what gave me the ability to add Wing Commander Lamington here. So I've taken the files provided by them to establish their corgi, who is named Muffin, and making a new one called Lamington with a collar with co-pilot slash... well, first officer slash also Wing Commander stripes. So the 3 full stripes is used for first officers in piloting contexts, and is the Wing Commander rank stripes in the Air Force. Anyway, beacon light is on, avionics setup is on, propeller area is clear except for that one guy, but he's fine. Fuel boost switch on. Fuel boost on, check. Fuel pressure low, not shown, check. Fuel flow 0, check. Starter switch to start. Ignition on, check. Oil PSI, check. NG climbing. NG stable. Fuel condition low idle. Fuel flow check. NG climbing. NG stable. Starter switch off. EIS readings check. Generator load check. Battery amps check. Fuel boost Normal. Avionics 2, check. Nav lights, check. Engine start checklist complete. I'm glad that listening to the checklist is very soothing. It's actually rather soothing to do as well. It's very systematic and so much harder to forget things, which is actually the point. Okay. And hopefully everybody has kept their seatbelts on and has got them now nicely secured as we're about to taxi and take off for our flight from East Sale to West Sale, flying over Sale. Thank you for flying Martel Air. We hope you don't die. Taxi lights. Before taxi checklist. Taxi lights, check. Seatbelt lights, check. Taxi clearance. East Sale ground, Martel 07, ready to taxi for west departure with information mic. Taxi 2 and hold short, runway 22, via taxiway Alpha, Charlie Bravo, cross runway 27, Delta, Martel 07. Taxi clearance check, nav source set, prop RPM to minimum, fuel condition low idle, inertial separated to bypass, parking brake off. Or taxi checklist complete. And good, that guy has moved out of our way. Lovely. It's actually a somewhat fascinating challenge to control taxi speed when the controls that you're given for the engine are actually designed to get you into the air, where taxiing is specifically not getting into the air. So this is one reason that the before taxi checklist includes prop RPM lever to minimum. It means that changes to the throttle, so how hard the engine goes, will have a smaller effect on the speed because we're putting less power into the propeller. Which is a very useful trick to have. Because if I keep it at the standard setup with prop lever to maximum, which is about 1900 RPM, as opposed to the 800-ish that it's doing at the moment, you can see that it would be a little more responsive to power inputs. Now, I can actually vary both of them depending on what I want to do with my ground speed. And the before takeoff checklist, you may have noticed, includes prop RPM to max. In fact, about half the checklists include this, because if you've been fiddling with prop RPM to reduce the effect of certain inputs, there are things where you don't want to suddenly discover that it's still at minimum. Most things really, except for taxiing. So you default to just pushing it to its default maximum position, and if you're doing something where you need it lower, you let it set lower, or you just get more fiddly. Okay, this is runway 27, and I was told cross runway 27, which means it is not an active runway. If they had this as the active runway and I was crossing it, I would have been told hold short runway 27. But in fact, I was told to cross runway 27 just in the taxi instructions. Because, fun fact, you never drive onto a runway unless you have been given specific instructions to drive onto that runway. I think the reasons for that are probably obvious. I hope they are. Basically the reasons are explosions. You don't want to be on a runway while somebody else is taking off or landing, because they've just, like, for takeoff, they've just put all of their settings to maximum power, and they might take half a runway length to stop. Like, that's why you get such a length of runway, because between rejected takeoffs and landings, you need quite a distance to stop a big plane. Even a small plane, this thing won't stop instantly, even if I throw the brakes on full and the engine into reverse. This engine actually has a very nifty reverse system. If you've got the proper RPM to max and you throw the throttle lever back past idle, it enters what's called a beta range, and then a reversing range, which instead of trying to reverse the engine, it just flips the propeller blades facing inwards. So, you know, this giant fan on the front suddenly starts pushing air forward as well. Now, very important flying fact is what this big fan on the front of the plane is actually for. Because, little known fact, but it's actually for pilot cooling. That's its main function. And you can tell this because when it stops spinning, the pilot really starts to sweat. Before takeoff checklist, parking brake set, altimeter QNH set, standby flight instruments check. Standby flight instruments, by the way, are these mechanical ones down at the bottom here, which are now covered by my face. So, if all of this fancy Garmin LCD panel technology fails us, we've still got the mechanical ones in the most awkward position possible, so that we can at least not die too much. Fuel boost switch normal. Fuel tank selectors both on. Fuel shutoff knob on. Standby alt power on. Anti-ice system not required, it's 22. Inertial separator handle normal. Autopilot heading mode, bank mode of flight level change. We will only be cruising at, I'm going to give us 3,400 feet over sail. Don't want to get too close. Altimeter, we've got, that is still set to the runway heading. Lovely. Heading, bank, flight level change set to VY in this case. Transponder is on alt. Flaps into takeoff position. And point of interest, the takeoff position on this plane is in fact labelled takeoff/approach. So sometimes I will call it takeoff position, sometimes I will call it approach position, depending on what we're doing, just to make sure that I've still got things clear. Takeoff clearance. East Sale Tower, Martel 07, ready for departure to the west at runway 22. Clear to take off, runway 22, Martel 07. Takeoff clearance check, strobe lights on, landing lights on, seatbelt light on, parking brake release, fuel condition high idle, prop RPM to max. And as we can see, it likes, with high idle, which is called flight idle as well, and basically idle thrust, on max RPM, it likes to creep forward and get going, which is why we have that low idle position. Now, this is a much bigger runway than the last takeoff because this base has one of the transport squadrons, which does much bigger planes than this. And advanced throttle levers. And the the engine spools up. And as it is a turbine engine, not quite a jet but the same mechanism, it takes a while for the engine to speed up. And rotate. And flaps up. Autopilot. We keep VX for a while. Sail tower, Martel 07, continue for west departure. And autopilot. And here we go, flying out over Sale. So yes, that was RAAF Base East Sale, or at least a little glance at it. They have rather a nice swimming pool there. They have a very confusing golf course, including a lake that is mostly poison. So when we lived on RAAF Base East Sale, the house we were in, which is, so there's a thing called married quarters, which is the quarters given to married personnel instead of a bunk room, because it's also where the family lives, because when you're moving every 2 to 3 years, you need somewhere for the family to live. And at one point, the married quarters that we got assigned was on the base, and facing, in fact, onto the golf course, because with anything where you got military officers, they're going to have a golf course. Sail tower, Martel 07, frequency change acknowledged. Sail approach, Martel 07 is type Cessna Caravan, 3 miles southwest of Sale, 2,800 feet, request flight following. Squawk 1524, Martel 07. Roger, Martel 07. So yes, the mostly poison lake. It was a lake of indeterminate depth on the RAAF Base golf course that was also a scrap metal dump for some reason. Probably had some toxic firefighting chemicals. Oh wow, we've got some interesting winds bumping us around up here. And like there was some old fridges. There were a couple of cars. There was some F-111 drop tanks slowly leaking avgas into it. We never went swimming in that lake, despite it being like 20 meters from the front door. Now that we are up and nicely stable, I'm actually going to do some manual flying so that we can have a look at the town of Sale. And yes, nasty mix indeed. We never actually touched the water because I'm pretty sure you'd get tetanus if you got that close. I don't think you'd even need to cut yourself to get tetanus off that lake. But you can see the golf course down here. This is that golf course, somewhere part of it, and now I've lost which. And of course it's also just things everywhere. The joys of trying to do navigation from the air that you only ever learned on the ground and like on foot. Because I was, I think, 13 when we left Sale, so it's been a while. Here we go. No, that was actually one of the satellite towns that I was looking at by mistake. That's the trick. So there you can see the actual town of Sale, and there's the airbase that we just took off from. Yes, Sale itself is not ridiculously small. From memory, it's I can't remember how many people. It's in the tens of thousands, like low tens of thousands from memory. So, you know, in this sort of area, it's the big town. And, you know, it has a lake. It has 2 public primary schools which have a hilarious rivalry. One of them has a name, the other one just has a number. Okay, so technically, the school, the second one, which was actually the first one founded, but it's second because of my own busted ideas of loyalty and, you know, tribalism. The second one is called Sale Primary School. Now that is the most generic thing you ever did here. It is also in the Victorian Department of Education system. It is school number 545. So we only ever called it 545. And 545 kids wear red and blue uniforms, where Araluan kids wear green and gold, which is clearly a much more sensible colour combination. So, you know, they're even colour coding the encouraged tribalism. It's hilarious. And there's a high school where the buildings start from the B block and go up. A block used to be the maths building until it was then the on fire building and then the not a building. But yes, pleasant enough little town if you're just passing through. I have my opinions on some of the people there. But you know, that's trauma dumping for you. Okay, and off to the front of us we can see West Sale Airport. And it is hilarious to me that you have East Sale RAAF Base, or RAAF East Sale, and West Sale Airport. They're not just RAAF Base Sale and RAAF Base and Sale Airport, which they could be, but because it was, and yes, 2 primary schools, both alike in dignity, very apt. But yes, because it used to be RAAF West Sale and RAAF East Sale, they remain West Sale and East Sale. Of course, the one problem with the both alike in dignity is I don't know if either of us had any dignity. Although I will grant you that both alike in dignity could in fact mean both alike in having absolutely no dignity. And to translate, primary school is Australian for what Americans would call elementary school and the first bit of middle school. We only have a 2-level split instead of 3. And we're just getting some distance away from the airport to come in properly for a landing. It is rather pretty countryside, I will grant you. Okay. Select approach. 27. Okay. Lovely. And of course, West Sale is big enough to actually have an airport terminal information service or system. I can't remember which one is the S in ATIS. So I can pull up which runway is currently in use. Which is why I just switched it over from 23 to 27. Which gives us a different approach to do. Keep hitting that button and I don't know why. You saw nothing. YWSL traffic, Martel 07, 9 miles east, 3,100 feet, inbound to land, runway 27. Less familiar with YWSL, having never actually been there. So we will see what it's like when I manage to get us into that sort of approach path. And of course there is East Sale, probably flying a little closer than I meant to. This is the joy of navigating while communicating. This is why we Aviate, Navigate, Communicate. I've not screwed up the Aviate, but by concentrating a little too much on the Communicate, I've screwed up the Navigate. Okay, approach checklist, seatbelt light on, fuel tank selectors both on, fuel condition high idle, prop RPM to max, flaps to approach position, landing lights on, inertial separator to bypass, brakes off. And we are currently below the glide slope, but holding altitude, which is good. You want to capture the glide slope from below. Never try to capture it from above, you will get crashy. And it is, again, a bit windy. Ah, there's the runway, lovely. I don't know if you can see the runway, but I can just make out what I'm pretty sure is the little vertical smudge that looks like a runway. It's not the vertical smudge that's much larger than it, which I'm pretty sure is the highway. Don't land on highways. I mean, people have had to, but it's a matter of... They have a lot of things sticking up, like light poles. Runways tend to have those mounted nice and low or nice and off to the side. Highways, they put them in the middle or right on the edge and sticking in. I mean, there's also cars and things, but those will dodge. But yes, there are a number of cases where people have had to do emergency landings on highways. In fact, some areas will have a long straight section every however far, specifically so that there's an emergency landing strip. They just designed that into their highways. I think Russian Deep Rural is one of the ones that does that, and I think certain parts of the US might do it as well. Because when you're crossing large distances, I mean, middle of Australia, there's less. Like, if you've got tyres that'll handle sand and dirt, you're basically okay. There's less in the way, but in places that are full of trees, like the big flat bit in the middle of Australia is Nullarbor Plain. well, the South Central Australia Nullarbor Plain, which is actually from the Latin for no trees. The middle of Australia, the bottom edge of that, is called the no trees plain. There's no trees there. There's a railway. Final approach checklist. Seatbelt lights on. Flaps to landing position. Autopilot staying on for now. And controlling the airspeed. That's getting a little low. Now this is a bit more of a crosswind landing, as I was talking about before. 10 to 15 knot crosswind. Which means that, so we're going forward we're hoping to land at about 80 knots. With a 15 knot crosswind, that's actually a fair proportion of, like, if you're doing 80 total, and 15 of that is taken up by going sideways, you've got less for going forwards with. And also it's complicated and weird. And the trick is not going too sideways and straightening up before landing. How much before landing is always the trick, especially as I switch it into manual flying instead of using an auto land, because that is much more sensible. Little more firm than the landing at East Sale, but any landing where you can reuse the plane afterwards. And for those who are unfamiliar, that is an adaptation of any landing you walk away from, and also the theory that any landing you can walk away from is a good landing. Any landing where you can reuse the plane afterwards is a great landing. Okay, after landing checklist, flaps up, anti-ice off. There's no taxiway down here, is there? I'm going to have to backtrack. Luckily it's not busy. So I can zoom in on our map. Oh, there is a taxiway right at the end. Lovely. Okay, after landing checklist. Flaps up, anti-ice off, standby alt power switch off. And the other... So the after landing checklist specifies turning the strobe and landing lights off. In fact, you do not do that until you've left the runway, because that is how other planes see you, as well as letting you see. And it used to be when getting ready to take off, you would turn off those lights, and it is now at any time when you're on the runway, because there have been too many accidents. See what I was saying before about crossing a runway when you're not given permission. Okay, strobe light off, landing lights off, taxi lights on. Before taxi checklist, taxi lights on, seatbelt lights on. West Sale traffic, Martel 07 is clear of the runway. And as this is not one with any direction, it is just free and uncontrolled, because it's much smaller than East Sale and much smaller than a lot of the other places. Prop RPM to minimum, fuel condition low idle, and parking brake off. And on the topic of the landing and strobe lights having to be on whenever you're on the runway, if you're wondering why you have to have them not on when you're not on the runway, as opposed to just, oh, if these make you more visible, just leave them on. The trick there is that they are incredibly bright. Landing lights are designed such that you can see the ground while you're in the air, and strobe lights are designed such that you can be seen from about 5 miles away, maybe 10. Having them on while taxiing is the equivalent of just driving around with your high beams on for no good reason. It's especially, like, it's bad for other pilots, and it's really bad for ground crews. Especially if they're operating at night, and you can just, if you have your strobes and your landing lights on in the wrong place, you can completely night blind or even actual blind people. Because, especially on bigger planes, those lights are no joke. They are specifically designed to be not funny. In a way that is quite funny. The engineering of landing lights is something that is a ridiculously deep topic and fascinating. You even get the things of... Some planes have retractable landing lights because they are such big spotlights of blinding capacity that they flip them back inside the wings when they're not using them, just to make it even slightly aerodynamic. You can also just have surface-mounted ones, like on this plane they are in the front of the wings next to the taxi lights, but in some planes they are much bigger. Now, which parking spot am I using? Not chopping the ground crew into spicy little pieces, as much as they seem to wander about and ask for it some days in this sim. But if we pull up next to this guy, we'll have some fun. And that is in fact one of the small Cessnas that I was talking about with the size comparison. Attention passengers, we've landed safely in West Sale and the local time is 2:49 PM. Please remain seated until the plane comes to a complete stop at whatever ridiculous parking spot they've given us here, and I've shut down the plane, because queuing for the exit in an 8-seater makes you look even more ridiculous than normal. Shutdown checklist. Parking brake set. Power lever idle. Bleed air heat switch off. ITT coming to minimum and stable. Prop RPM to feather. Fuel condition cut off. Inertial separator handle to normal. Attention passengers, this now concludes our flight from Mount Beauty to East and West Sale, and we here at Martel Air hope that you've enjoyed your time in our tiny sky bus. Please wait until I've opened the door and you can calmly deplane in an orderly fashion. Our baggage handling services today will be provided by our wonderful passengers, so thank you for not leaving any of your luggage behind. Any personal belongings left behind as you leave the plane will be assumed to be a present to the pilot and enjoyed thoroughly. Thank you for flying Martel Air. We hope you don't die. Lights off. Fuel boost switch off. NG 0 check. Avionics 2 off. Avionics 1 off. Battery switch off. Fuel tank selectors both off. Shutdown checklist complete. And that gets us to the end of today's flights. Thank you everybody for coming along with me on this, and I'm just going to show you the other bit of texturing work I've been working on. The pilot's uniform on my avatar here is now in fact wearing what I am, except also with the bright pink captain stripes there, which I have yet to add to this shirt, but nice black pilot shirt instead of the white with gold stripes that it defaults to. And of course we can see Wing Commander Lamington there, helpfully just assisting with all of the flight duties and keeping an eye on the instruments. And yes, it is a small airport, and the size comparison to those little things there is just utterly hilarious. You can see why this thing can carry most of a ton between passengers and cargo. And that thing is, I'm not sure if that's the 2-seater or the 4-seater. But hopefully you've all enjoyed that, and this has been an hour and 50-minute stream, which is more than I was expecting to do. So thank you everybody, especially if you've made it all the way through. That is more stream than I was planning on doing. I need to keep that in mind. But I will see you next time for a flight down 90 Mile Beach and interesting facts about its name.